Hello, we're going to take another run through another section of the AP World Curriculum today with developments in Dar el-Islam. Now, Dar el-Islam, we need to know this phrase. This is literally translated from the Arabic for the House of Islam. Basically, all the territories and regions of the world that encompass the Islamic faith. During this time period, we're going to be talking about regions as far west as the Iberian Peninsula or Spain in Western Europe, across North Africa, into the Middle East and beyond into Persia. And then, of course, as history develops, Islam is going to spread even further than that. We're going to start with the AP theme of governance. Again, this idea of governance is how people rule themselves or how people are ruled by others, what kind of laws and policies are set up for the states. And what we need to know about this Dar el-Islam, one, there is no one political entity. It is a huge territory. Originally, the Islamic world was controlled largely by one political entity. And these were known as caliphates. The word caliph or caliph, that is a successor to Muhammad. So after Muhammad's passing, there was a series of caliphs and eventually basically dynastic rule of a caliph's family. The two that were the most prominent in world history are the Umayyad Caliphate and then the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, the Abbasid Caliphate, we're going to talk more about them. They last much longer than the Umayyads, taking rise in the year 750 and lasting all the way until the 13th century. Quick timeout. Remember, AP World students, 13th century is the 1200s. In my head, when I'm studying these things, when I'm reading about them, whenever I read the 13th century, I kind of translate in my own head the 1200s. That helps me out a lot. By the time we get to this period of the 1200s, we're going to see that this Abbasid Caliphate is really just a shell of what it once was, not really holding a lot of political power anymore. It's quite fragmented, and there's new political entities that have arisen. And there's a few that you want to be familiar with. First, probably the largest and most influential in the region is a group known as the Seljuk Turks. These guys rose in the 11th century, and they established a Muslim sultanate that ruled much of the Middle East and Persia, leaving the Abbasid Caliph as merely a religious figure in Baghdad. Another group is known as the Mamluks. These guys are over in Egypt and slightly beyond into what is known as the Levant, kind of like the Eastern Mediterranean region. These were former slaves, either slave soldiers or slave bureaucrats, which we're going to learn this year is kind of common in Islamic states, that eventually kind of usurp the power and begin to rule themselves because they've got all the brilliant bureaucrats and they've got the weapons and the soldiers. So the Mamluks are going to eventually take over and rule their own sultanate. And these guys are going to be important because they're going to be the ones that stop the expansion of the next group that we're going to talk about, the Mongols. The Mongols are a Central Asian nomadic group that pushes across Asia, eventually conquering the biggest territory of any empire in world history, biggest land-based territory at least. And we'll talk about them more in a few weeks. But the Mongols are going to push into the Middle East as well. They are the guys that actually sack the city of Baghdad and bring all of the Abbasid Caliphate officially to an end. And that happens in the year 1258. And then the Mongols will begin to rule that region of the Middle East as one of their what we call khanates. It's basically a Mongol kingdom, but instead of being ruled by a king, you're ruled by a khan. We'll talk about those guys a little bit later. We've also got some cultural developments and interactions. Again, that's another theme of AP World that we need to deal with. And obviously, if we're talking about Dar el-Islam, the biggest cultural development we need to mention is the growth and the expansion of the religion of Islam. Now, Islam is born in the 7th century. Time out. 600s in the Arabian Peninsula. And it's really a continuation of the traditions, of the religious traditions of the Jews and the Christians that came before them. We call the religion of Islam an Abrahamic monotheistic faith. Abrahamic means it traces its origin to the same Abraham that is the founding patriarch of the Jewish faith and the Christian faith. Monotheism, it's a one God faith. Muslims believe in one God. That God is called Allah within Islam because that is the Arabic word for God. Muhammad is believed to be, by Muslims, the final prophet of God, the last human being that is going to have these interactions, these conversations with God. There will, according to Muslims, never be another. And Muhammad is going to take those conversations or those words of God that he was given by an angel, and he's going to share them with his followers. Eventually, those are going to be written down in a book that is known as the Quran. This new religion that Muhammad begins and grows is going to unite Arabs from different tribes that had never really been united before into a new group that we can call the Ummah, U-M-M-A, the Ummah. And this Ummah is an Islamic community that unites people that had previously not shared any unison. In fact, they squabbled and they warred and they had conflicts. And now they've got something in common with each other in this common faith. And from the 7th century on, Muslims are going to spread, or the religion of Islam is going to spread due to what we call in this class the 3 M's: military activity, merchant activity, and missionary activity. They will spread because of military conquest. They will spread because of trade, and they will spread because people are literally moving and taking their faith with them. And you can see from this map the extent of this spread of Islam as we get around the year 1200. And you can see its origins in the Arabian Peninsula, but eventually spreading all the way across North Africa to Western Europe and across the land of Persia into what is today northern India. Now, let's take a closer look at some of these cultural developments within Dar al-Islam and why this political entity, this cultural entity is so important. First, there's a deep appreciation for science and learning and understanding of knowledge, and a translation and a preservation of the knowledge gained from earlier thinkers like the Greeks and the Romans and the Persians. The Muslims hold on to this stuff. They preserve it in libraries and they study and they make further advancements. Advancements like in mathematics and astronomy, and a lot of their advances in mathematics come from a close connection with what has been going on in South Asia. For example, the Arabic numerals that you and I use, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, those actually originated in India, made it to the Arab world where they used them, and that's how Europeans came in contact with them. So Europeans kind of mistakenly refer to them as Arabic numerals. Also, a number of medical advancements. If you were a sick guy in the year 1000 or 1100 or 1200, you would much rather be taken care of in a Muslim hospital than by any physicians in Europe. The Muslims being kind of at the center of this connection between Europe and Asia and Africa also bring in ideas from different places that they can help facilitate the spread. For example, the adoption of paper making from China, and that will eventually make it further into the West. This era in Islamic history, really even dating back earlier in the earlier Abbasid Caliphate, is known as the flowering of Islamic learning, and it's really just a high point of Islamic intellectual activity. You should be familiar with this man's name, Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. He's what we would call a polymath. He's kind of one of these like Renaissance men before the European Renaissance was ever a thing. You might know or might not want to know that he's the guy that really kind of developed what we call trigonometry today. But he was also a poet and an astronomer and a physician. So he really had his hands in a lot of pots, and he's a good example of the intellectual activity that's taking place within Dar al-Islam. Also be familiar with the House of Wisdom I've already mentioned in Baghdad. Baghdad was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate and one of the largest cities in the world in this era of around 1200. And scholars from around the region and even beyond would go to Baghdad to study and learn and go into the libraries and places like the House of Wisdom to grow and share their ideas. Oh, we're going to talk about this much more later, but this device is an invention within the Persian region of Dar el-Islam called the astrolabe. This was a device that was used by navigators on the open sea, and you could tell positions of stars or tell your position based on the position of stars. And it was also a calendar and a timepiece. It had all sorts of uses. I encourage you to spend a couple minutes hopping onto YouTube and watching a couple videos about astrolabes, because they really are fascinating pieces of technology and pieces of art. We'll talk about those because they're going to help guys like Christopher Columbus eventually make their way across the ocean to the Americas. I also want you to be familiar with Sufism. Sufism is a mystical branch of Islam, and this is like any religion. It's got a lot of different interpretations, or at least ways to practice the faith. Sufism is one of those more mystical practices. When we talk about mystics this year, we're going to be talking about people that kind of make their own personal connection to God, maybe absent of the church or the synagogue or the mosque, in this case with religion of Islam. Now, the Sufis who practice this mystical branch of Islam, and you can see this man here, he's one of a member of a Sufi group known as the Whirling Dervishes. And they basically, through a dance, through a twirling dance, meditate and feel a close connection with God. Now, these guys weren't always appreciated in their communities. Remember, they're kind of doing the religion on their own without connecting with the local mosque and the local religious leadership. And so they often weren't accepted into the local communities, so they moved. And as they moved and as they traveled, they're going to take religious beliefs with them. And so these guys have to, these guys are a big contributor to that third M: military, merchant, missionary activity, the people spreading religion with them as they move. And that would be the Sufis. I'm going to talk a little bit about Islamic society, some things that you should know that we kind of see throughout the Islamic world. First, high status of merchants. Muhammad himself was a merchant before he became the leader of this faith and the leader of a new state. And so trade connections are going to be central and very respected and important to the growth and success within states of Dar el-Islam. We generally see a toleration of non-Muslims. We can use this word dhimmi. The dhimmi population is a protected class. These are basically Christians and Jews, or what are known as people of the book. They follow the same religious tradition as the Muslims themselves. And so there was a general toleration. If you were a Jew in the 13th century, 1200s. If you were a Jew in the 13th century, you would likely fare much better on a day-to-day basis in an Islamic community than you would in a Christian community at the same time. Slavery is permitted within the Islamic world, just as it was permitted in most of the rest of the world at this time. But there were restrictions. For example, Muslims themselves could not be enslaved. Typically, slaves were imported from other regions like Africa or Eastern Europe or Central Asia. But many slaves were able to gain their freedom within their lifetimes. This is not the same kind of slavery that we're going to talk about later that is so... that we know much more about with regard to American slavery, what we call chattel slavery. This is very different. The majority of slaves in the Islamic world were women who served as concubines or domestic servants, or served in harems, which is basically a home where a rich guy would have a bunch of rooms filled up with women. And these women did not have the same kind of freedom that a free citizen would have had. Speaking of women within Islam, they typically maintain the cultural norms of the region they live in. So we want to remember that this Dar al-Islam region is huge. So we've got a lot of different cultures within this Islamic world. So there's not one way that women are going to be living within this world. So, for example, the wearing of the head covering, hijab. This was not originally within requirements of the original Arabic Islam, but as it spread north into the Middle East, where women did wear those head coverings, it became more prominent. We do generally see a higher social status of women in Islam than in Christian or Jewish communities. For example, women could inherit property, they could own businesses, they could initiate divorces, but this was still a patriarchal society. This was still a male-dominated society overall. But we do want to remember that Islam had great appeal to not only men, but also women, because both men and women could achieve salvation in the afterlife. So everybody, according to the religion of Islam, is equal in the eyes of God. I also want to bring up this phrase because one of the most important things that we talk about within AP World is connections between different civilizations, and this idea of Al-Andalus. Now that is Spain. That is Spain when it was ruled by Muslims. So it's the Iberian Peninsula from roughly the 8th century, 700s, to all the way into the 15th century. 1400s, not much was left at that point. But this was when the Al-Andalus was the name for Islamic Spain, basically, Islamic Iberian Peninsula. And this was a place where the Islamic world and the European world came together, and in many cases, the Europeans were going to learn a lot about Islamic developments from this connection point. The capital city of Al-Andalus was called Cordoba, and this became a center of learning, kind of like Baghdad would have been in the East. This became a center of learning in the West, and a way that Islamic intellectual activity could make its way into Europe at this time. To wrap it up, if you only walk away with 3 things, know that the Islamic world brought a connection point on important trade routes between Africa, Europe, and Asia. Islam brought unity across all these regions. It created this huge population of people who were all members of the same faith or members of the Islamic community, the Ummah. And they preserved, the Islamic world preserved the learning from the Greeks and the Romans and the Persians, and blended that traditional learning with new advancements that were created within the Islamic world and brought from outside, like places like South Asia and East Asia in China. And then from there to be passed on to eventually places like Europe. So that's a wrap for today. We'll be back in a couple days with developments in South Asia. Take it easy.